Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in her family. While her younger sister Elena commanded attention with her bold personality and infectious laughter, Sarah preferred the safety of observation. She watched from the sidelines as life unfolded around her, carefully choosing her words like precious stones she was afraid to lose. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in October. Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her navy blue sweater for the third time. At 17, she had learned to dress in colors that helped her blend into the background. Her dark hair fell in gentle waves around her face, and her brown eyes held a depth that few people took the time to notice. "Sarah, breakfast," her mother's voice echoed up the stairs. Maria Martinez had immigrated from Mexico 20 years ago with dreams bigger than the small apartment they now called home. She worked double shifts at the local hospital as a nursing assistant, her hands always smelling faintly of antiseptic and hope. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with familiar morning chaos. Elena, 2 years younger but infinitely more confident, sat at the small round table, her school books scattered around a half-eaten bowl of cereal. She was already dressed in her cheerleading uniform, the bright red and gold colors making her look like a small sun in their modest kitchen. "Mom, can you drive me to school early today? We have extra practice before the homecoming game," Elena said, not looking up from her phone where she was rapidly typing messages to friends. "I have to leave for work in 10 minutes, Mija. Can't Sarah drop you off?" Maria replied, pouring coffee into a travel mug that had seen better days. Sarah grabbed an apple from the counter, her stomach too nervous for anything substantial. "I can walk. It's not that far." "Don't be silly," Elena said, finally, looking up. "Mom, just drop me off first. Sarah can wait 5 minutes." This was how it always worked in their family. Elena's needs came first, not because Maria loved her more, but because Elena's voice was louder, her presence more demanding. Sarah had learned long ago that it was easier to adapt than to fight for attention she wasn't sure she deserved. The drive to Riverside High School was quiet except for Elena's chatter about the upcoming game and the drama surrounding who would be crowned homecoming queen. Sarah stared out the window at the familiar streets of their neighborhood, where chain-link fences separated small yards filled with children's toys and dreams deferred. "Remember, Sarah," Maria said as they pulled up to the school's main entrance, "your father is picking you both up after school. He has news to share." Sarah's heart skipped. Their father, Roberto, worked construction and rarely picked them up from school. News usually meant one of two things in their family: someone was sick or money was tighter than usual. Neither option filled her with confidence. The hallways of Riverside High were already crowded with students rushing to their lockers and first-period classes. Sarah navigated through the familiar maze, keeping her head down, and her backpack clutched tightly against her chest. She had perfected the art of being invisible, moving through crowds like water around stones. Her first class was Advanced English Literature with Mrs. Thompson, one of the few teachers who seemed to see something in Sarah worth nurturing. The classroom smelled of old books and fresh coffee, and Sarah always chose the same seat. Third row, middle section, close enough to show she was paying attention but far enough back to avoid being called on unexpectedly. "Today we're going to discuss the power of voice in literature," Mrs. Thompson announced as students settled into their seats. "How authors use dialogue and internal monologue to reveal character." "Sarah, would you start us off by reading the passage from page 43? Sarah's cheeks flushed as 25 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her book, but her voice, when it came, was clear and steady. She had always been a good reader, finding strength in other people's words when her own felt inadequate. As she read about a character struggling to find her voice in a world that didn't want to listen, Sarah felt a strange resonance. The words seemed to echo something deep inside her chest, a longing she had never quite been able to name. "Beautiful reading, Sarah," Mrs. Thompson said when she finished. "Can you tell us what you think the author is trying to say about the importance of speaking up?" Sarah hesitated, feeling the familiar panic that came with being the center of attention. "I think," she began slowly, "that sometimes people are afraid to speak because they've been taught that their words don't matter. But the character learns that staying silent can be more dangerous than speaking up, even if your voice shakes." The classroom was unusually quiet, and Sarah could feel Mrs. Thompson's approving smile even without looking up. "Exactly," Mrs. Thompson said. "Voice isn't just about volume. It's about courage." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of classes and hallway navigation. Sarah ate lunch alone in the library, preferring the company of books to the social minefield of the cafeteria. She was reading when she heard familiar laughter echoing from the main hallway. Elena was surrounded by her usual group of friends, all of them animated and glowing with the particular confidence that came with being 17 and popular. Among them stood Camilla Rodriguez, Elena's best friend since middle school. Camilla was everything Sarah wasn't: tall, outgoing, with perfectly styled blonde hair, and clothes that looked like they came from magazines rather than discount stores. She had a way of commanding attention that seemed effortless, and her laugh was the kind that made other people want to join in, even when they weren't sure what was funny. Sarah watched from behind her book as the group discussed plans for after the homecoming game. She had learned to listen to Elena's social life from a distance, picking up fragments of teenage drama and excitement like a radio tuned to a frequency just out of reach. "My parents are going out of town this weekend," Camilla was saying, her voice carrying easily down the hallway. "We should totally have a party after the game. Nothing crazy, just us and maybe some of the football team." Elena's eyes lit up with excitement. "That sounds perfect. Sarah could help us set up and clean up afterward." Sarah felt her stomach clench. This was how it always went. She was included in Elena's plans as support staff, never as an actual participant. She was the one who helped carry decorations, who stayed late to pick up empty cups and forgotten jackets, who made sure everyone got home safely while never quite being part of the fun herself. "Does Sarah even talk?" Camilla asked with a laugh that wasn't entirely kind. "I swear, every time I see her, she's just standing there staring at everyone like she's taking notes for a research project." Sarah's cheeks burned as Elena laughed along with her friend. "She's just shy? She'll grow out of it." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Elena spoke about her like she was a phase, something temporary and slightly embarrassing that would eventually be outgrown. The book in Sarah's hands felt suddenly heavy, and she realized she had been holding her breath. The afternoon classes dragged by with unusual slowness. Sarah found herself replaying the hallway conversation over and over, each repetition making Camilla's words sting a little more. She had always known she was different from Elena's friends, but hearing it spoken aloud made the difference feel like a chasm she could never hope to cross. When the final bell rang, Sarah gathered her books and made her way to the front parking lot where her father's weathered pickup truck was already waiting. Roberto Martinez was a man of few words, but his presence had always been a source of comfort for Sarah. His hands, permanently stained with paint and calloused from years of manual labor, told stories of hard work and quiet dignity. Elena bounced into the passenger seat, still glowing from cheerleading practice and full of energy about the upcoming game. Sarah climbed into the back, settling into the worn bench seat that smelled faintly of sawdust and her father's cologne. "How was school, mijas?" Roberto asked as he pulled away from the curb. "Amazing." Elena launched into a detailed account of her day, from the new cheerleading routine she had helped choreograph to the drama surrounding homecoming court nominations. Her words filled the truck cabin with excitement and life. Sarah listened, as she always did, offering appropriate nods and smiles when Elena paused for breath. She had become an expert at being an audience for her sister's life, supportive and present, but never quite stepping into the spotlight herself. "And Sarah?" Roberto's eyes found hers in the rearview mirror. "It was fine, Papa," she said softly. "We read some good poetry in English class." Roberto nodded, understanding something in her tone that Elena missed entirely. He had always been better at reading Sarah's silences than her words, recognizing in his older daughter a sensitivity that reminded him of his own mother, who had been a quiet observer of the world around her. They stopped at a red light, and Roberto cleared his throat in the way he did when he had something important to say. "I wanted to tell you both together," he began, his accent making his words sound more formal than usual. "I got promoted at the construction site. I'm going to be a foreman now." Elena squealed with delight, immediately launching into questions about what this meant and whether they would be able to move to a bigger house or buy a newer car. Sarah felt a warm glow of pride for her father, who had worked so hard for so long without recognition. "That's wonderful, Papa," she said quietly. But Roberto caught her eyes in the mirror again, and she could see how much her approval meant to him. As they drove through their neighborhood toward home, Sarah watched the familiar houses pass by the window. Each one told a story of families trying to make it work, of dreams being pursued in small increments, of love being expressed in the daily acts of showing up and staying together. Their own house was a small 2-bedroom rental with a front yard that Roberto kept meticulously maintained despite having little time for yard work. The living room was crowded with furniture that didn't quite match, but had been chosen for comfort rather than style. Family photos covered every available surface, documenting birthdays and graduations and ordinary moments that had become precious through the simple act of preservation. "Sarah, help me start dinner," Maria called from the kitchen as soon as they walked through the front door. "Elena, go change out of that uniform before you spill something on it." In the kitchen, Sarah and her mother worked together in comfortable silence. They had developed a rhythm over the years, Maria handling the main cooking while Sarah chopped vegetables and set the table. It was one of the few times Sarah felt truly useful, contributing something concrete to her family's daily life. "You seem quiet today, even for you," Maria observed as she seasoned the chicken that would become their dinner. "Everything okay at school?" Sarah considered telling her mother about Camilla's comment, about the feeling of being invisible even to her own sister. But she had learned that her mother carried enough worries without adding Sarah's social anxieties to the load. "Just tired," she said instead, which wasn't entirely a lie. Being invisible was exhausting work. Dinner was filled with Elena's continued excitement about the homecoming game and Roberto's careful explanations of what his promotion would mean for the family. Sarah listened and contributed when spoken to directly, but mostly she observed, filing away details about her family's dreams and fears for later consideration. After dinner, as she helped clear the table, Sarah caught sight of herself in the reflection of the kitchen window. In the glass, surrounded by the warm light of her family's kitchen, she looked like a ghost, present but not quite real, there but not entirely seen. Later that evening, alone in the bedroom she shared with Elena, Sarah sat at the small desk they had wedged between their twin beds and opened her journal. Writing had always been her sanctuary, the place where her thoughts could exist without judgment or interruption. She wrote about Mrs. Thompson's English class, about the character who had learned to use her voice despite her fear. She wrote about her father's promotion and the pride that had shone in his eyes when she congratulated him. She wrote about feeling like a supporting character in her own life, always present, but never central to the story being told. As she wrote, Elena got ready for bed, chattering about her plans for the weekend and the party at Camilla's house. Sarah half listened, her pen moving across the page in the familiar rhythm that had become her evening ritual. "Sarah," Elena said suddenly, pausing in her bedtime routine, "you don't mind helping with Camilla's party, right? I know you're not really into that stuff, but it would mean a lot to me." Sarah looked up from her journal, meeting her sister's eyes in the mirror above their shared dresser. Elena's expression was genuinely hopeful, without any awareness of how her request might feel to someone who was never invited to participate, only to serve. "Of course," Sarah said, because it was easier than explaining how it felt to always be needed but never wanted. "I'm happy to help." Elena smiled, the bright expression that had always been her trademark. "You're the best sister ever. I don't know what I'd do without you." The words were meant as a compliment, but they settled over Sarah like a comfortable blanket that was also a gentle prison. She was needed, valued even, but always in the context of making someone else's life easier, never for her own dreams or desires. That night, as Elena's breathing settled into the steady rhythm of sleep, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling. The events of the day swirled through her mind. Camilla's careless cruelty, Elena's unconscious dismissal, the moment in English class when her voice had felt strong and clear. She thought about the character in the story they had read, who had learned that silence could be more dangerous than speaking up. Sarah had spent so many years perfecting the art of not being seen that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to want to be heard. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the low rumble of traffic on the highway that led out of their neighborhood and toward the wider world. She wondered what it would feel like to follow that road, to find a place where her voice mattered, where her thoughts and dreams were worth listening to. As she finally drifted toward sleep, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would find her voice, even if it meant risking the comfortable invisibility she had spent so many years cultivating. Even if it meant disappointing the people who had grown used to her silence. The promise felt small and fragile in the darkness of her shared bedroom, but it was hers. And, for now, that was enough to help her believe that tomorrow might hold possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The next morning brought an unusual energy to the Martinez household. Elena bounced around the kitchen in her school clothes, but her mind was clearly already focused on the evening's homecoming game. Sarah moved through her morning routine with the same quiet efficiency she had perfected over the years, but something felt different. The promise she had made to herself the night before hummed quietly beneath her usual careful composure. Sarah, can you braid my hair before the game tonight? Elena asked between bites of toast. You're so much better at it than I am, and I want it to look perfect. Sure, Sarah replied. But this time she noticed the automatic way she agreed to help without being asked what she might want to do. The observation felt like a small awakening, uncomfortable, but necessary. Roberto had already left for his first day as foreman, his excitement evident in the extra care he had taken with his appearance and the way he had kissed both his daughters goodbye. Maria rushed around gathering her work things, the double shift at the hospital requiring her to leave earlier than usual. Remember, girls, I won't be home until late tonight. Elena, make sure you eat something before the game. And, Sarah, there's leftover chicken in the refrigerator for dinner. Maria paused at the door, her nurse's bag slung over her shoulder. Be good for each other. The words carried more weight than usual, perhaps because Maria sensed something shifting in the careful balance of their family dynamics. She looked at Sarah for a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to read something in her older daughter's expression. After their mother left, the house settled into an unusual quiet. Elena was uncharacteristically subdued, perhaps feeling the pressure of the evening's game and the social events that would follow. Sarah found herself watching her sister with new eyes, noticing how Elena's confidence seemed to require constant external validation. Are you nervous about tonight? Sarah asked, the question surprising them both with its directness. Elena looked up from her phone, where she had been scrolling through social media posts about the game. A little, she admitted. What if I mess up the new routine? What if everyone expects me to be perfect because I'm Elena Martinez, and I can't live up to it? The vulnerability in Elena's voice revealed something Sarah had never considered before, that her sister's apparent confidence might be as carefully constructed as Sarah's own invisibility. They were both performing roles they had created for themselves, just on opposite ends of the visibility spectrum. You'll be great, Sarah said, and meant it. You always are. Thanks, Elena replied, then hesitated. Sometimes I wish I could be more like you, you know? You don't seem to care what other people think. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. If only Elena knew how much mental energy Sarah spent thinking about what others thought, carefully calibrating her behavior to avoid judgment or attention. But perhaps that was the difference. Elena sought approval, while Sarah sought to avoid disapproval. The walk to school that morning felt different. Sarah found herself noticing details she usually overlooked. The way the autumn sunlight filtered through the trees lining their street, the sound of children laughing in a nearby playground, the determination in the faces of her neighbors heading to work. The world seemed more vivid somehow, as if her decision to find her voice had sharpened her vision as well. In first period English, Mrs. Thompson had arranged the desks in a circle for what she called a voice workshop. Sarah's stomach clenched as she realized there would be no hiding in the back row today. She chose a seat and tried to make herself as small as possible, but Mrs. Thompson's knowing smile suggested that invisibility would not be an option. Today we're going to practice something that many of you find terrifying, Mrs. Thompson announced once everyone was seated. We're going to share our own writing. Not for a grade, not for criticism, but simply for the act of being heard. A collective groan arose from several students, but Sarah felt something unexpected, a flutter of anticipation mixed with her usual terror. She had been writing in her journal for years, but she had never shared those words with anyone. We'll start with volunteers, Mrs. Thompson continued. But everyone will have a chance to share something, even if it's just one sentence that matters to you. The first few students read pieces about typical teenage concerns, crushes, college anxiety, family expectations. Sarah listened with growing appreciation for the courage it took to speak personal truths aloud, even in the relatively safe space of Mrs. Thompson's classroom. Sarah, Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through her thoughts. Would you like to share something? Every instinct told Sarah to decline politely, to claim she hadn't brought anything worth sharing. But the promise she had made to herself the night before seemed to whisper from somewhere deep in her chest. I have something, she heard herself say. She pulled out her journal, hands trembling slightly as she found the entry from the previous night. The words looked different on the page now that she was considering sharing them. More vulnerable, more revealing than she had remembered. It's just a few thoughts, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We're listening, Mrs. Thompson said gently. Sarah began to read, her voice gaining strength with each word. She read about feeling like a supporting character in her own life, about the exhaustion of being invisible, about the fear that her thoughts and dreams might not be worth hearing. She read about wanting to matter, not just as someone who helped others shine, but as someone who had her own light to offer. When she finished, the classroom was completely silent. Sarah could feel her cheeks burning, and she wanted nothing more than to disappear entirely. But then, she looked up and saw something she had never seen before. Her classmates were really looking at her, seeing her perhaps for the first time. "Thank you, Sarah," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice thick with emotion. "That was brave and beautiful." Marcus Chun, who sat across the circle and had never spoken to her before, nodded thoughtfully. "I feel that way sometimes too. Like I'm always helping other people tell their stories, but never getting to tell my own." Several other students murmured agreement, and Sarah realized that her feelings weren't as unusual as she had thought. The isolation she had felt was shared by others who had also learned to make themselves small in various ways. The rest of the class passed in a blur of shared stories and newfound connections. When the bell rang, Sarah gathered her things slowly, still processing what had just happened. She had spoken her truth aloud, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, something had begun. "Sarah, could you stay for a moment?" Mrs. Thompson asked as students filed out. Sarah approached the teacher's desk, uncertain what to expect. Mrs. Thompson was organizing papers, but her attention was fully focused on Sarah. "What you shared today was remarkable," she said. "Have you ever considered submitting your writing to the school's literary magazine? We're always looking for authentic voices, and yours deserves to be heard by more people." Sarah's first instinct was to decline, to insist that her writing wasn't good enough for publication. But something had shifted during the class discussion, a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. "I could think about it," she said instead. "Good," Mrs. Thompson smiled. "I think you'd be surprised by how many people would connect with your words." The rest of the school day felt surreal. Sarah moved through her classes with the same quiet efficiency as always, but something fundamental had changed. She had spoken her truth and been heard. The experience had left her feeling both vulnerable and powerful, like she had discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed. At lunch, instead of hiding in the library as usual, Sarah found herself sitting at an empty table in the cafeteria. She wasn't ready to approach other groups, but she was done hiding entirely. She pulled out her journal and began writing about the morning's experience, trying to capture the feeling of being truly seen. "Mind if I sit here?" a voice asked. Sarah looked up to see Marcus Chun standing beside her table, lunch tray in hand, and an uncertain expression on his face. "Of course," she said, surprised by how natural her voice sounded. Marcus settled into the seat across from her, and for a moment they sat in comfortable silence. Sarah had never really talked to Marcus before, despite sharing several classes over the years. He was quiet like her, but in a different way, more thoughtful than fearful, more selective than invisible. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said finally, "for what you shared in English class. It made me realize that I'm not the only one who feels like I'm living on the sidelines of my own life." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. Her words had mattered to someone else, had helped another person feel less alone. This was what she had been missing all these years, the connection that came from being authentic rather than invisible. "It was scary," she admitted. "I've never shared my writing with anyone before." "It was brave," Marcus corrected gently. "Sometimes the scariest things are the most worth doing." They spent the rest of lunch talking about books, about writing, about the strange experience of feeling like outsiders in their own lives. Sarah discovered that Marcus wrote poetry and had been afraid to share it for many of the same reasons she had hidden her own thoughts. They made plans to read each other's work, a commitment that felt both exciting and terrifying. As the school day wound toward its end, Sarah felt a growing sense of anticipation about the evening ahead. Not for the homecoming game itself, which she would attend to support Elena, but for the opportunity to continue practicing this new version of herself, the one who spoke up, who shared her thoughts, who took up space in the world. The final bell brought the usual rush of students toward buses and cars, but Sarah walked slowly, savoring the feeling of being present in her own life rather than simply observing it from a distance. She found Elena waiting by their father's pickup truck, practically vibrating with excitement about the game. "How was your day?" Elena asked as they climbed into the truck. Usually, Sarah would have given a brief, non-committal answer. But today felt different. "Actually, it was really good. I shared some of my writing in English class, and it went better than I expected." Elena looked surprised, perhaps because Sarah rarely volunteered information about her day with such enthusiasm. "That's great. I didn't even know you wrote anything besides school assignments. I keep a journal, Sarah said simply. I've been writing in it for years. Roberto caught Sarah's eyes in the rearview mirror, and she saw something like pride in his expression. Your grandmother was a writer, he said. She used to fill notebook after notebook with stories and poems. I still have them in a box in the closet. Sarah felt a jolt of connection to a family history she had never known about. Could I see them sometime? Of course, Mija. She would have loved to know that you inherited her gift. The conversation continued as they drove home, but Sarah found herself thinking about this new piece of information. She wasn't just discovering her own voice. She was connecting with a legacy of voices that came before her. At home, Sarah helped Elena prepare for the game, braiding her sister's hair with the same careful attention she had always given to helping others shine. But this time, she didn't feel diminished by her supporting role. Instead, she felt like she was choosing to contribute her skills while maintaining her own sense of self. You seem different today, Elena observed as Sarah worked. More present, I guess. Sarah considered the observation. I think I'm just trying to be more myself instead of trying to be invisible. Good, Elena said firmly. I like this version of you better. You should definitely come to Camilla's party tomorrow night. Not just to help, but to actually hang out with us. The invitation surprised Sarah, both because it was offered freely and because she found herself actually considering it. A week ago, she would have declined automatically, preferring the safety of home to the social complexity of a teenage party. But today, she felt curious about what might happen if she said yes. Maybe I will, she said, and meant it. As evening approached, and it was time to leave for the homecoming game, Sarah looked at herself in the mirror. She was wearing the same navy blue sweater she had chosen that morning, but something about her reflection looked different. Her posture was straighter, her expression more open. She looked like someone who had something to say and was learning to say it. The football stadium was already packed with students, parents, and community members when they arrived. Sarah had always found large crowds overwhelming, but tonight she felt more curious than anxious. She watched the interactions around her with the eye of a writer, noticing details she had previously been too nervous to observe. Elena disappeared with the other cheerleaders to prepare for their performance, leaving Sarah to find a seat in the stands. She climbed to a section that offered a good view of both the field and the crowd, pulling out her journal to write about the energy and excitement surrounding her. Sarah? She looked up to see Marcus climbing the bleachers toward her, a hesitant smile on his face. I didn't know you came to games, he said as he settled beside her. I usually just come to watch Elena cheer, Sarah replied. But tonight feels different. Everything feels different. They sat together as the game began, sometimes talking about what they observed, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she never had at social events before. She wasn't trying to be invisible or worrying about saying the wrong thing. She was simply present, engaged, authentic. When Elena and the other cheerleaders took the field for halftime, Sarah watched with genuine pride as her sister performed the routine they had practiced for weeks. Elena was radiant under the stadium lights, every movement precise and confident. For the first time, Sarah felt like she could admire her sister's gifts without feeling diminished by comparison. As the routine reached its climax, Sarah found herself on her feet, cheering loudly for Elena's performance. Her voice rang out clear and strong, no longer afraid to be heard. Several people around her turned to look, and instead of shrinking back, Sarah smiled and continued cheering. The moment felt symbolic of everything that was changing in her life. She was learning to celebrate others without making herself smaller, to take up space without apology, to use her voice even when it shook with nervousness or rang out with joy. When the routine ended and Elena looked up into the stands, their eyes met across the distance. Elena's surprised smile suggested she had heard Sarah's cheers, and for the first time in their lives, Sarah felt like a true participant in her sister's moment rather than just an observer. The second half of the game passed quickly, and as the crowd began to disperse, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with the football score. She had spent an entire evening being authentically herself in a social setting, and it had felt natural rather than terrifying. Want to wait for Elena together? Marcus asked as they climbed down from the bleachers. Sure, Sarah replied, realizing that she was building genuine friendships based on who she actually was rather than who she thought she should be. As they waited by the fence that separated the field from the parking area, Sarah reflected on the day's events. 24 hours ago, she had been invisible, silent, afraid to take up space in her own life. Tonight, she had shared her writing, made a friend, cheered loudly for her sister, and felt proud of herself for the first time in years. Elena emerged from the locker room, glowing with post-performance adrenaline, and immediately spotted Sarah and Marcus by the fence. "Sarah, I heard you cheering." "Thank you." Elena threw her arms around her sister in an enthusiastic hug. "You were amazing," Sarah said, and meant it completely. "I'm so proud of you." "I'm proud of you too," Elena said, stepping back to look at her sister with new eyes. "You seem, I don't know how to explain it, more like yourself tonight." As they walked toward their father's truck, Sarah realized that Elena was right. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was becoming herself rather than trying to be someone else or trying to be no one at all. The journey was just beginning, but she had taken the first real steps. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to practice using her voice. There would be Camilla's party, where Sarah would have to decide how much of her newfound confidence she was ready to test in a more intimate social setting. There would be her writing to consider sharing more widely, and friendships to nurture, and countless moments to choose authenticity over invisibility. But tonight, sitting in the back of her father's truck with Elena chattering about the game and Marcus texting poetry lines to her phone, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before: the deep satisfaction of being seen, heard, and valued for exactly who she was. The promise she had made to herself was already beginning to transform her life, and she could hardly wait to see what tomorrow would bring. Saturday morning arrived with an unusual energy in the Martinez household. Sarah woke before her alarm, her mind already buzzing with thoughts about the day ahead. For the first time in years, she was genuinely excited about a social event, Camilla's party that evening. The old Sarah would have spent the day anxiously rehearsing conversations that might never happen and imagining worst-case scenarios. The new Sarah, the one who was learning to use her voice, felt nervous but determined. Elena was already awake, her side of the room a hurricane of clothes, makeup, and cheerleading gear from the previous night. She sat cross-legged on her bed, phone pressed to her ear, talking to Camilla about plans for the party. "No, we definitely need more snacks," Elena was saying. "And Sarah said she'd help set up, so we can get there early." "Yes, Sarah, my sister. She's actually coming to hang out tonight, not just to help." Sarah felt a flutter of appreciation that Elena was defending her right to attend as a guest rather than just support staff. It was a small gesture, but it represented a shift in how Elena saw her sister's place in social situations. After Elena finished her call, the sisters worked together to clean their shared room, a Saturday morning ritual that usually involved Elena talking while Sarah listened and organized. But today, Sarah found herself contributing more to the conversation, sharing observations about their classmates and offering opinions about Elena's social dilemmas. "You know," Elena said as she folded the cheerleading uniform she had worn the night before, "I never realized how much you notice about people. You have really good insights about stuff I never think about." Sarah paused in her organization of their shared bookshelf. "I guess when you spend a lot of time watching instead of talking, you pick up on things. Maybe I should try watching more and talking less," Elena mused. "Sometimes I feel like I'm performing all the time, you know? Like everyone expects Elena Martinez to be this certain way, and I can't disappoint them." The vulnerability in Elena's voice surprised Sarah. She had never considered that her sister's confidence might be as carefully constructed as her own invisibility. They were both performing roles they had created for themselves, just on opposite ends of the social spectrum. "Maybe we both need to find a middle ground," Sarah suggested. "You could talk a little less, and I could talk a little more, and we'd meet somewhere in between." Elena laughed, but it was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "I'd like that. I think I'd like to know what my sister actually thinks about things instead of just assuming she agrees with me." Roberto appeared in their doorway, still wearing his work clothes despite it being Saturday. The promotion to foreman meant more responsibilities, but also more Saturday shifts when deadlines were tight. "I have to go to the job site for a few hours," he announced. "But first, Sarah, you wanted to see your grandmother's notebooks?" Sarah's heart leaped. In the excitement of the previous day's developments, she had almost forgotten about her father's revelation that her grandmother had been a writer. The idea of connecting with this family legacy felt like discovering a missing piece of herself. Roberto led both daughters to his bedroom closet, where he moved aside winter coats and old photo albums to retrieve a cardboard box that had seen better days. He handled it with the reverence reserved for precious things, and Sarah felt her breath catch as he lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of notebooks in various stages of wear, their covers ranging from simple composition books to leather-bound journals with hand-tooled designs. The pages were filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting in both Spanish and English, documenting everything from family recipes to philosophical observations to complete short stories. Abuela Carmen started writing when she was your age, Roberto explained, his voice soft with memory. She said it helped her make sense of a world that often didn't make sense to her. She was quiet, like you, but her mind was always working. Sarah carefully opened one of the notebooks, her grandmother's words flowing across the page in elegant script. The entry was dated 30 years ago, and it described the challenge of finding her voice as a young Mexican woman in a community that often overlooked her perspectives. She wrote about feeling invisible too, Sarah whispered, the connection across generations making her feel less alone in her struggles. Read this one, Elena said, pointing to a passage that had caught her attention. It's about the importance of speaking up, even when your voice shakes. Sarah read aloud, her grandmother's words seeming to speak directly to her current situation. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. My voice matters, even if others have forgotten how to listen. Especially then. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the legacy of a woman who had faced her own challenges with finding her voice in a world that often ignored women like her. Sarah felt a deep connection to this grandmother she had barely known, and a renewed determination to honor that legacy by continuing to speak up. Take whichever notebooks you want to read, Roberto said, gathering his work things. She would be proud to know that her granddaughter inherited her gift for words. After Roberto left for work, Sarah and Elena spent the morning reading through their grandmother's writing. Elena was particularly drawn to the stories about family life, while Sarah was captivated by the philosophical observations and poems that reveal the depth of thought she recognized in herself. Listen to this, Elena said, reading from a notebook filled with family stories. It's about when Papa was little, and he tried to run away from home because he wanted to see the ocean. As Elena read their grandmother's account of Roberto's childhood adventure, Sarah found herself seeing her family's history in a new light. These weren't just relatives she had heard about in passing. They were real people with dreams, fears, and stories worth preserving. We should ask Papa to tell us more family stories, Sarah suggested. And maybe we should write them down before we forget. That's a great idea, Elena agreed. You're really good at writing. Maybe you could interview everyone and create like a family history book? The suggestion sparked something in Sarah's imagination. She could envision herself as the family historian, using her writing skills to preserve the stories that connected them all. It was a role that played to her strengths while contributing something meaningful to her family's legacy. The afternoon was spent in preparation for the evening's party. Maria had returned from her hospital shift and was enjoying a rare Saturday afternoon at home. She helped both daughters choose outfits, offering motherly advice about looking nice without trying too hard. Sarah, this color is beautiful on you, Maria said, holding up a deep red sweater that Sarah had bought, but never worn because she thought it was too bright, too attention-getting. It's too much, Sarah protested automatically. It's perfect, Elena chimed in from across the room. You should definitely wear it. Red is your color. Sarah looked at herself in the mirror wearing the red sweater, and, for the first time, she didn't immediately focus on ways to make herself smaller or less noticeable. The color brought out the warmth in her brown eyes and complemented her olive skin tone. She looked vibrant, alive, present. Okay, she said, surprising herself with the decision. I'll wear red. As evening approached, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of social anxiety mixing with genuine excitement. She had spent years avoiding parties, convinced that she would be awkward, boring, or simply ignored. But the events of the past few days had given her a new perspective on social situations. Instead of focusing on all the ways she might fail, she found herself curious about the conversations she might have and the connections she might make. Elena, meanwhile, was in full preparation mode, treating the party like a performance that required perfect execution. Sarah watched her sister apply makeup with the precision of an artist, choosing each cosmetic carefully to create a look that projected confidence and approachability. Are you nervous? Sarah asked as Elena finished with her lipstick. Elena paused, considering the question more seriously than Sarah had expected. Yeah, actually. I always am before parties. What if people think I'm trying too hard? What if they realize I'm not as fun as they think I am? The admission revealed another layer of Elena's carefully constructed confidence. Sarah realized that her sister's social success required just as much emotional labor as Sarah's invisibility, just expressed in a different way. "You're going to be great," Sarah said. "And if anyone doesn't appreciate how genuine and caring you are, that's their loss." Elena turned from the mirror to look at her sister with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." As they prepared to leave, Maria gathered both daughters for one of her motherly wisdom sessions. "Remember," she said, "you don't have to be anyone other than who you are. The right people will appreciate your authentic selves." The advice felt particularly relevant to Sarah, who was embarking on her first real experiment in social authenticity. She had spent so many years hiding who she was that she wasn't entirely sure what her authentic self would look like in a party setting. Camilla's house was in a neighborhood slightly more upscale than theirs, with larger yards and newer cars in the driveways. Sarah felt a familiar pang of social anxiety as they approached the front door, but she reminded herself of her grandmother's words about courage being more important than fear. The party was already in full swing when they arrived, with music playing and groups of classmates scattered throughout the living room and kitchen. Sarah's first instinct was to find a quiet corner where she could observe without participating, but she forced herself to stay present and engaged. "Sarah," Marcus's voice cut through the party noise. She turned to see him approaching with a genuine smile and a red plastic cup in his hand. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here," Sarah admitted. "But Elena convinced me to come hang out instead of just helping set up." "Good for you," Marcus said. "Want to get something to drink and find somewhere we can actually hear each other talk?" As they made their way to the kitchen, Sarah noticed how different the party looked when she was participating rather than just observing. The other guests weren't the intimidating social elite she had imagined. They were just teenagers trying to have fun, some more successfully than others. Camilla was holding court near the snack table, surrounded by her usual group of admirers. She looked effortlessly perfect in the way that had always made Sarah feel invisible by comparison. But tonight, Sarah found herself studying Camilla with new eyes, noticing the careful way she managed her image and the effort required to maintain her position as social queen. "Sarah Martinez." Camilla's voice carried easily across the kitchen. "I can't believe Elena got you to come to a party. This is like seeing a unicorn in the wild." The comment was delivered with a laugh, but Sarah heard the familiar edge of dismissiveness that had stung her in the school hallway. The old Sarah would have blushed and mumbled something self-deprecating. But this Sarah, the one who had been finding her voice over the past few days, felt something different rise in her chest. "I'm full of surprises," Sarah replied evenly, meeting Camilla's eyes with steady confidence. Camilla blinked, clearly not expecting Sarah to respond with anything resembling wit or self-assurance. The moment stretched between them, filled with the attention of everyone within earshot. "Well," Camilla said after a pause, "good for you for finally joining the land of the living." The comment was meant to sting, to put Sarah back in her place as the quiet observer who didn't quite belong. But instead of retreating, Sarah felt her grandmother's courage flowing through her. "I was always alive," Sarah said clearly. "I was just selective about where I chose to shine." The kitchen fell unusually quiet, and Sarah could feel Elena's surprised attention from across the room. Marcus stepped closer, offering silent support, and several other students watched the exchange with interest. Camilla's perfectly applied smile wavered slightly. She was clearly used to dismissing Sarah without resistance, and this new version of the Martinez sister was outside her experience. "Well, aren't you just full of revelations tonight?" Camilla said, trying to regain her social footing. "Actually, I am," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I'm discovering that I have a lot to say when I'm around people who know how to listen." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with terror. She had just directly challenged someone who held significant social power in their school hierarchy. The old Sarah would have been horrified by her own boldness. But as she looked around the kitchen, Sarah saw something unexpected in the faces watching their exchange. Instead of judgment or mockery, she saw curiosity, respect, and, in some cases, admiration. Several students nodded approvingly, and Jessica Chun, Marcus's sister who Sarah had never spoken to before, gave her a subtle thumbs up. Elena appeared at Sarah's side, her expression mixing pride with protective concern. "Hey, want to show me where you put the music playlist?" she asked Camilla, smoothly redirecting attention away from the confrontation. As Camilla led Elena toward the sound system, clearly relieved to escape the unexpected challenge to her authority, Marcus leaned close to Sarah's ear. "That was amazing," he said quietly. I've never seen anyone stand up to Camilla like that. Sarah felt her heart racing, but not entirely from nervousness. There was something exhilarating about speaking her truth, about refusing to be dismissed or minimized. She was discovering that her voice, when she chose to use it, was stronger than she had ever imagined. The rest of the party passed in a blur of conversations and connections that would have seemed impossible just days before. Sarah found herself talking with classmates she had observed from a distance for years, discovering shared interests and perspectives she never would have uncovered from her previous position of invisibility. Jessica Chin turned out to be a fellow writer who had been intimidated by Sarah's thoughtful presence in their shared classes. "I always wanted to talk to you," Jessica admitted as they sat together on Camilla's back porch. "But you seemed so self-contained, like you had everything figured out." "I was just scared," Sarah replied honestly. "I thought if I stayed invisible, I couldn't be rejected or judged." "But you were judging yourself harder than anyone else ever would," Jessica observed. "At least, that's what I do when I'm hiding from people." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics from writing and family expectations to dreams and fears about the future. Sarah discovered that many of her classmates had been as intimidated by her quiet intensity as she had been by their apparent confidence. As the party began to wind down, Elena found Sarah on the porch and settled beside her with visible relief. "I'm exhausted from being on all night," Elena confessed. "Sometimes I think you have the right idea, being more selective about when you engage. And sometimes I think you have the right idea about putting yourself out there," Sarah replied. "Maybe we're both learning from each other." The drive home was quiet, both sisters processing the evening's experiences in their own ways. Sarah stared out the window at the familiar neighborhood streets, but they looked different somehow, less like barriers keeping her contained, and more like pathways leading to possibilities she was just beginning to explore. At home, Maria was waiting up for them, as she always did when her daughters went out. She took one look at Sarah's face and smiled with maternal understanding. "How was your first real party, Mija?" she asked. "Different than I expected," Sarah replied. "Scarier and better at the same time. That's usually how it goes when we step outside our comfort zones," Maria said. "Your grandmother would have been proud of you for taking that risk." As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred over just a few days. She had found her voice, challenged someone who had dismissed her, made new friends, and discovered that authenticity was both more difficult and more rewarding than she had imagined. But she also recognized that this was just the beginning. Finding her voice was one thing. Learning how to use it wisely was another challenge entirely. There would be times when speaking up might cause conflict, when her honesty might hurt people she cared about, when her newfound confidence might lead her into situations she wasn't prepared to handle. Elena was already asleep when Sarah finally climbed into bed, but she could sense a new quality to their relationship. More equal, more honest, more real. They were both evolving, both learning to balance their natural tendencies with new ways of being in the world. As she drifted toward sleep, Sarah thought about her grandmother's notebooks, full of wisdom about courage and authenticity. Tomorrow she would start writing her own entries, documenting this journey of finding her voice and claiming her place in her own life. The promise she had made to herself was becoming a reality, but Sarah was beginning to understand that finding her voice was not a destination but a daily choice. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment of choosing authenticity over invisibility was another step in a journey that would last her entire life. But tonight, surrounded by the satisfaction of having been truly seen and heard for who she was, Sarah felt ready for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. She had tasted the power of her own voice, and there was no going back to silence. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often follows significant changes. Sarah woke with a sense of anticipation rather than dread, her weekend transformation still humming through her consciousness like a song she couldn't forget. The red sweater from Saturday night hung in their shared closet like a banner of her newfound confidence. But this morning she chose something more understated, not because she wanted to hide, but because she was learning to let her voice rather than her clothes carry her presence. Elena was unusually quiet as they prepared for school, perhaps processing her own realizations from the weekend. Sarah noticed her sister spending less time perfecting her appearance and more time simply being present in the moment. They were both evolving, both finding new ways to navigate the world that felt more authentic than their previous roles. Do you think people will expect me to be different now? Sarah asked as they walked to school together. Another small change from their usual routine, where Elena rushed ahead with friends while Sarah trailed behind. Maybe, Elena replied thoughtfully. But that's good, right? You were hiding so much of yourself before. Now people get to see who you actually are. The observation was both comforting and terrifying. Being seen meant being vulnerable to judgment, criticism, rejection. But it also meant being known, understood, valued for her authentic self rather than her ability to stay invisible. The hallways of Riverside High seemed different as Sarah navigated them that Monday morning. Several classmates who had never acknowledged her before offered smiles or nods of recognition. Word of her confrontation with Camilla had apparently spread through the social networks that powered teenage communication, and Sarah found herself being viewed with new interest. Sarah Martinez, right? A girl named Ashley from her chemistry class stopped her near her locker. I heard what happened at Camilla's party. Good for you for finally saying something. The comment was well-intentioned, but it revealed how her years of silence had been perceived by her classmates. She hadn't been invisible by choice. In their eyes, she had been invisible because she was weak, intimidated, lacking in confidence. The truth was more complex, but Sarah realized that she would need to own this new narrative about finding her strength. In first period English, Mrs. Thompson had arranged another circle discussion, this time focusing on character development in the novel they were reading. Sarah found herself participating more naturally than ever before, offering insights that drew from both the text and her own recent experiences with personal transformation. Sarah makes an excellent point about the protagonist's journey, Mrs. Thompson said after Sarah had analyzed a particularly complex passage. Sometimes the most profound changes happen not when we become someone new, but when we finally become who we were meant to be all along. The words resonated deeply with Sarah's own experience. She wasn't becoming a different person. She was uncovering the person who had been there all along, buried under layers of fear and self-protection. After class, Marcus fell into step beside her as they walked toward their next period. You seem more yourself every day, he observed. It's like watching someone come into focus. It feels like that too, Sarah admitted. Like I'm finally seeing myself clearly for the first time. Have you thought about joining the literary magazine? Marcus asked. We could really use someone with your perspective and writing ability. Sarah's first instinct was to decline, to insist that she wasn't ready for such visibility. But that instinct belonged to the old Sarah, the one who chose safety over growth. This Sarah was learning to lean into opportunities that scared her. Tell me more about it, she said instead. Marcus explained that the literary magazine met every Tuesday after school and published a quarterly collection of student writing, art, and photography. They were always looking for diverse voices and fresh perspectives, and several of Sarah's teachers had mentioned her name as someone who might contribute meaningfully to their work. The next meeting is tomorrow, Marcus said as they reached Sarah's classroom. You should come, even if you just want to observe and see what we do. As Sarah settled into her desk for second period history, she found herself genuinely considering the invitation. A week ago, the idea of voluntarily joining any extracurricular activity would have been unthinkable. Now it felt like a natural extension of the voice she was discovering. Lunchtime brought another small revolution. Instead of eating alone in the library, Sarah accepted Jessica Chin's invitation to sit with her and several other students at a table in the cafeteria. The conversation ranged from upcoming assignments to weekend plans to philosophical discussions about the books they were reading. I never realized you were so funny, commented David Park, a quiet boy from her physics class who turned out to have a similar sense of humor. Your observations about our teachers are spot on. Sarah felt a warm glow of recognition. Her years of careful observation were finally finding an appreciative audience. She had learned to notice the small details that others missed, to find humor in the everyday interactions that most people took for granted. These skills, developed during her years of invisibility, were becoming assets in her new life of engagement. The afternoon brought an unexpected challenge. As Sarah walked past a group of Camilla's friends in the hallway, she overheard a conversation that made her stomach clench. I can't believe Sarah Martinez thinks she's suddenly hot stuff, one of them was saying. Like, congratulations, you spoke up one time. That doesn't make you interesting. Seriously, another voice chimed in. She's been weird and antisocial for years, and now she expects everyone to treat her like she's some kind of reformed person? People don't just change overnight. Sarah felt the familiar heat of embarrassment and shame flooding her cheeks. The old Sarah would have ducked into the nearest bathroom to hide until the feeling passed. But this Sarah, the one who was learning to trust her own worth, took a deep breath and kept walking. The comments stung because they contained a grain of truth. She was asking people to see her differently than they had for years. But they also revealed something about the speakers, who seemed threatened by the idea that people could grow and change. Sarah realized that her transformation challenged their own complacency, their own fears about stepping outside established roles. In her final period of the day, AP Psychology, the class was discussing identity formation and the factors that influence personal development. Sarah found herself thinking about her own recent changes as their teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, explained the concept of self-actualization. Self-actualization, Mr. Rodriguez was saying, isn't about becoming someone new. It's about removing the barriers that prevent us from being who we authentically are. It requires courage to face our fears and to risk being rejected for our true selves. Sarah felt like the lesson had been designed specifically for her current situation. She raised her hand, surprising herself with the impulse to participate in a class discussion she would normally have observed silently. What about when other people resist your growth? She asked. When they want you to stay the same because your changes make them uncomfortable? Mr. Rodriguez's face lit up with the expression teachers get when a student asks exactly the right question. That's one of the most challenging aspects of personal development, Sarah. Growth often threatens the status quo, and people who benefit from existing dynamics may consciously or unconsciously try to pull you back to your previous patterns. So how do you handle that? Sarah persisted. You remember that their resistance is about them, not you, Mr. Rodriguez replied. Your growth isn't responsible for their discomfort. Your job is to be authentic to yourself, not to manage other people's feelings about your authenticity. The words hit Sarah like a revelation. She had spent so many years trying to manage other people's comfort levels, staying small so others could feel big, remaining silent so others could dominate conversations. But her growth didn't require anyone else's permission or approval. After school, Sarah found herself walking slowly toward the main exit, processing the day's experiences and conversations. She was learning that finding her voice was an ongoing process, not a single moment of transformation. Each day brought new opportunities to choose authenticity over invisibility, courage over comfort. Sarah, Elena's voice called from behind her. Sarah turned to see her sister approaching with an expression of mixed concern and admiration. I heard what happened in the hallway with Camilla's friends, Elena said. Are you okay? Sarah considered the question seriously. Was she okay? The comments had hurt, but they hadn't devastated her the way they would have a week ago. She was developing resilience along with her voice. I'm okay, she said, and meant it. It stung, but it also made me realize how much stronger I am now than I was before. Elena nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about what you said Saturday night, about me performing all the time. You're right. I get so exhausted trying to be what everyone expects Elena Martinez to be. As they walked toward their father's pickup truck, Elena continued. I've been watching how you're changing, and it's making me think about who I really am underneath all the cheerleader, popular girl stuff. Maybe I need to find my authentic voice too. The conversation revealed how Sarah's transformation was rippling through her family relationships. By choosing authenticity, she was giving others permission to examine their own patterns of performance and hiding. Roberto was waiting in the truck with a small smile on his face. How was your first Monday as the new Sarah? He asked. Challenging, Sarah replied honestly. But good challenging, not scary challenging. Your grandmother always said that growing feels uncomfortable while it's happening, Roberto shared. Like a snake shedding its skin. Necessary, but not easy. That evening at dinner, the Martinez family conversation took on a different quality than usual. Instead of Elena dominating with stories from her day while Sarah listened quietly, both sisters contributed equally to the discussion. Maria noticed the change immediately. It's nice to hear both my daughters' voices at the dinner table, she observed. Sarah, you've always had interesting thoughts, but now you're sharing them with us. I'm learning that my thoughts are worth sharing, Sarah replied. And that keeping them to myself was actually selfish. I was depriving you all of my perspective. The insight surprised even Sarah herself. She had always thought of her silence as humble, self-effacing, polite. But she was beginning to understand that hiding her authentic self was actually a form of withholding, a way of avoiding the risk and responsibility that came with being fully present in her relationships. After dinner, as Sarah helped clear the table, Maria pulled her aside for a private conversation. I want you to know how proud I am of the woman you're becoming, Maria said quietly. I was worried about you for a while. You seem so lost in yourself, so afraid to take up space in the world. But watching you find your voice has been beautiful. Were you disappointed in me before? Sarah asked, voicing a fear she had carried for years. Never disappointed, Maria said firmly. Concerned, maybe. I could see so much wisdom and strength in you. But you kept it hidden. I didn't know how to help you share it with the world. The conversation revealed another layer of Sarah's transformation. Not only was she changing how she saw herself, but she was also changing how others saw her and how they related to her. Her growth was creating space for deeper, more authentic relationships with her family members. Later that evening, Sarah sat at her desk with her grandmother's notebooks spread around her and her own journal open to a fresh page. She had decided to document her transformation not just for herself, but as a record that might someday help others who were struggling to find their own voices. She wrote about the day's challenges and victories, about the comments that had stung and the moments that had affirmed her growth. She wrote about the complex process of changing not just how she saw herself, but how she moved through the world and related to others. As she wrote, Sarah realized that finding her voice was revealing layers of strength and wisdom she had always possessed but never accessed. Her years of careful observation had given her insights into human behavior that others valued. Her natural empathy allowed her to connect with people who were also struggling with authenticity. Her thoughtful nature meant that when she did speak, her words carried weight and meaning. The shy, invisible girl she had been wasn't someone to be ashamed of. She was the foundation for the confident, articulate woman Sarah was becoming. Every experience, every moment of hiding, every careful observation had contributed to the depth and authenticity of her emerging voice. A soft knock on her bedroom door interrupted her writing. Elena stood in the doorway, already dressed for bed but clearly wanting to talk. Can I ask you something? Elena said, settling on the edge of Sarah's bed. Of course. How did you know you were ready to change? Like, what made you decide to stop hiding? Sarah considered the question, thinking back to the moment when she had made the promise to herself to find her voice. I think I got tired of being a supporting character in my own life, Sarah said slowly. I realized that by staying invisible, I was cheating myself and everyone around me out of knowing who I really was. Elena nodded thoughtfully. I think I've been the opposite problem. I've been performing the main character so intensely that I've lost track of who I actually am underneath the performance. Maybe we can help each other, Sarah suggested. You can remind me when I'm retreating too much, and I can remind you when you're performing too hard. I'd like that, Elena said with a smile that looked more genuine than any Sarah had seen from her sister in years. As Sarah prepared for sleep that night, she reflected on the complexity of personal transformation. It wasn't a linear process of becoming someone new. It was an excavation of who she had always been, a careful removal of the fears and defenses that had hidden her authentic self from the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to practice using her voice. There would be the literary magazine meeting to consider, classmates to continue building relationships with, and the ongoing work of learning to balance confidence with humility, authenticity with kindness. But tonight, surrounded by her grandmother's wisdom and her own growing understanding of herself, Sarah felt ready for whatever came next. She had tasted the power of her own voice, and she was learning to trust not just in her right to be heard, but in the value of what she had to say. The promise she had made to herself was becoming a way of life, a daily choice to show up authentically rather than hide safely. And with each day that passed, the choice became easier, more natural, more essentially who she was meant to be.